All right, thank you very much. We appreciate your patience as we got transferred over. Hello again. For those of you who weren't here earlier, my name is Victoria Samson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first session of the SSA Policy Forum, which Secure World Foundation is delighted to work on with MEDB. And this morning's session is called Using SSA to Verify Future Space Security Agreements. As the international community strives to negotiate space security agreements, the question arises about how to verify actions on orbit and whether the agreed-to behavior is being followed. SSA can provide a technical foundation for verification. By understanding what SSA can do, states are better placed to negotiate behaviors that can be confirmed by outside observers. This panel will discuss what verification means in our arms control context, and just kind of setting the stage because I know for a lot of people in this audience, this is a new topic for them. They will discuss, lay out where discussions stand at the international level on space security and stability issues, explain why norms of behavior are key to space security and stability, and the role that SSA plays in establishing those norms, and then finally, how SSA capabilities can be applied to verify future space security agreements. In a matter of time, I'm just going to go straight to the questions. Today's panel will have a few questions for each speaker from me. And I would encourage the audience to submit questions. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So I'm going to also have each speaker just quickly introduce themselves when I ask them their questions. The first one, all the way down at the end. Hey, Ben. Ben Silverstein, can you introduce yourself really quickly? And then I'd like you to talk a little bit about what does verification mean in this context? And generally speaking, what types of monitoring must be placed for effective verification?
Thanks, Victoria. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure. I'm Ben Silverstein. I am the research analyst for the Carnegie Endowment Space Project. And verification in this context is it's a five-step process for arms control agreements or treaties, and it really starts with treaty language and negotiating the terms of a treaty. So when we think about it, if it's not in a treaty, then you can't verify it. Any activities to investigate certain types of things outside of treaty language, that's just intelligence gathering, which is all well and good, but it's not really part of verification. The next two steps, which I think are probably the most near and dear for this audience, are monitoring and analyzing the issues or targets of interest. After that, after the data is collected and analyzed, it goes again back to a political process of evaluating that, those analyses. The analysis really should be, the point of analysis is to reduce the amount of uncertainty. That's definitely not an unfamiliar concept to most, if not all of you. But this is a political issue, the evaluation. So it really depends on what the political powers that be, whether this is a bilateral or a multilateral agreement, what comfort level they have with certain types of uncertainty. Is 80% uncertainty good enough? Is 50% uncertainty good enough? It all depends. After that, it goes to a resolution process. Based on the uncertainty and based on understanding what may have happened or what has happened, the resolution process is, again, a political step. So if we think about it, 3 out of the 5 steps are really political. Negotiating a treaty, evaluating the analysis, and then going back and resolving the issue through any sort of compensatory action. And so I think what's really important with this is understanding that no treaty is 100% verifiable. That's a fact of life, and political entities have to deal with that. But there are certain levels of comfort with different levels of uncertainty. And so verification really has to enable the political entities to be able to take compensatory action, and that depends, again, whether it's a bilateral or multilateral treaty, what that compensatory action may be. So really what we're looking at when we talk about verification is being able to get the evaluation done quickly and to be able to get it, to resolve the issues before an adversary or before the non-compliant partner gains material, military, or other advantages. So in a short nutshell, that's verification for treaty or other security agreements.
Great, thank you, Ben. Next, Almudena, could you talk a little bit about what's happening at the international level at the United Nations in discussing these issues, and also talk about what type of space security agreements might require verification?
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you to the AMOS conference organisers for having me here. It's such an honour to be here. I am Almudena Azcarate Ortega. I'm a researcher at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, where I lead research on space security issues. Well, first of all, I thought that it would be useful to give a bit of context as to what the open-ended working group on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviour is, as we are discussing these issues of verification in that group. Well, this process has its origin actually a couple of years ago through a resolution 7536 proposed by the UK initially, which encouraged states to submit comments to the Secretary General as to what they considered to be the most pressing threats to space security and what they considered to be responsible and irresponsible behaviours. Several states submitted comments, actually around 30 states, and also several non-state actors. So Secure World Foundation was actually one of them. This process shed a light into an issue that we've been facing at the UN, and is that usually processes tend to be top to bottom. So states propose a measure, and then other states agree, and other states disagree, and this creates sort of different teams. I'm team, I want a legally binding solution. I'm team, I want a non-legally binding solution, for example. But this process, which was bottom up, highlighted that no matter what team states usually were part of, they actually had very similar concerns when it came to space security matters. So this process that led to this Secretary General report was hugely successful, and it led to a subsequent resolution last year, that was Resolution 75231, that led to the creation of this open-ended working group. This open-ended working group essentially has a mandate to do four things. Firstly, to take stock of the legal framework and the normative framework applicable to space. Secondly, to assess current and future threats to space security. Thirdly, to make recommendations on what constitutes responsible and irresponsible behaviours. And lastly, to come up with a report on those recommendations to submit to the General Assembly next year. And so you might be asking, why is this process different to other multilateral processes? You know, space security has been a part of the world, has been around for quite a bit of time, and we haven't been able as an international community to find many solutions to it. So why is this different? And I would highlight maybe three things. Firstly, the fact that it's open-ended. That means that everybody is welcome to join, participate, and submit their own initiatives. So while it is state-led, non-governmental entities such as commercial actors and civil society, academia, can be part of it and can share their expertise with states, which is often really needed because commercial industry, for example, they have the know-how that states often do not have. Secondly, it focuses on behaviours instead of capabilities. So traditionally, states have looked at capabilities that seem dangerous and how to ban or how to sort of reduce the types of uses that they could be given. But now states are more focused on limiting how states use those capabilities, that is to say, how they behave in space. Because they acknowledge that many space objects are essentially capability neutral. So capabilities are not inherently dangerous in and of themselves. And lastly, the last point that I would highlight is the fact that, again, this process has sort of highlighted that states have very similar concerns when it comes to space security, and that no matter what solution a state might think it's best, whether it's legally binding or non-legally binding, they don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. They actually are complementary. In fact, the Outer Space Treaty started out as a UN resolution. So for space security masses, we could initially have some sort of normative agreement that is non-binding, and that could eventually create the common understanding that is needed among states to eventually lead to an effective legally binding agreement. And how does verification tie into all of this? Well, actually, many states have highlighted that in order for a treaty to be successful, it needs to be verifiable. And for example, a few years ago, Russia and China proposed a legally binding treaty. They proposed a draft treaty to prevent the placement of weapons in outer space. And this highlighted that for many states, it's really important that space security solutions be legally binding. But many other states were concerned that this treaty proposal did not have a verification mechanism. So it was helpful to highlight that, yes, legally binding is a priority for many, but it needs to be verifiable. And so how can you verify a treaty? Well, as Ben highlighted, only treaties can be verified. If it's a non-legally binding mechanism, then we would be talking about monitoring. And SSA is something that comes up in conversations all the time. Sometimes it seems that states think SSA is going to be the be-all, end-all of solutions for verification. And while it is very useful, it does present some concerns. Not everything can be monitored, not every object can be monitored at all times, but by just one state. So some have suggested that cooperation when it comes to SSA verification might be necessary. Also, some concern raised by especially emerging spacefaring actors is that not every state has the same technological capabilities to conduct SSA. And so SSA, well, it's a very useful tool in order to be able to actually be used to verify treaties or to monitor non-binding agreements, should be used in conjunction with other types of tools, like, for example, transparency and confidence building measures to encourage communication between different actors. I will leave it at that and look forward to discussion during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Almu. Next, we have Doug. Doug, introduce yourself really quickly. I understand you have some PowerPoint to show, and then I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about ways in which SSA has identified unusual or atypical behavior.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Victoria. So I'm Doug Kendricks. I'm the CEO of ExoAnalytic. We're a commercial space domain awareness company. If you're looking at my first chart, there we go. Oh, could you go back to the title? So what we do is we have a network of ground-based optical telescopes, about 350 of them. I'm going to try to show you how we have used our network to support verification or potentially future verification of treaties and whatever comes out of the work being done at the UN. Bonus points to anyone in that opening figure who has found all of the Starlink trains. And I'll just say there's more than 5. And we're going to look at some more images like this where you're going to get to see some data. And hope you enjoy it. Next chart. So what can we do? When I was young, we learned about how newspapers work, and it was who, what, when, where, why, and how sometimes. What we can do with ground-based optics, like a network that we have, is who, what, where, when. And we don't do the why. And I have to make that point a lot of times, just from ground-based optics without other contextual information or information that governments have. We don't know why things are happening, but what we can do is we can tell the difference between spacecraft behaviors that are due to the sun and the moon and the earth and the planets, naturally occurring forces, versus ones that are man-made. We just don't know their intention. And so I've listed some of the things that we can do there. We can look at attitude changes of spacecraft from the light bouncing off of them. We can detect maneuvers because objects are no longer moving according to the natural forces, and then you can see some of the other things. So that is kind of the limit of what we can do, but there's a lot that can be done to help folks that are trying to verify on-orbit behaviors. Next chart. So we've been doing this for about a decade. Just have some of the more interesting things listed on the left. And an interesting note is that back when we first started this, when we would see interesting things, there was no customer for some of the things that we were seeing. We saw an interesting close approach with a NOAA satellite and an AMC satellite way early in our company's history. And we used LinkedIn and YouTube and other ways to communicate with the operators. And Space News was our only customer, but they weren't paying us. So we didn't quite have a business yet. Next chart. So we watch satellites, and we primarily focus on geo and the near geo region. And we watch satellites over their entire life. And what you're seeing here is the birth of a satellite. We'll track them on the way up to geo. If they go into a geotransfer orbit, we'll track them into that orbit and watch them circularize. This one was a direct to geo. We'll watch anything that we can see. We can see plumes. We can see, you're seeing a maneuver there, and all we're doing here is pointing the telescope in the sky, and it's not moving. And as soon as a satellite hits geosynchronous orbit, it just sort of stops. And I'll just stop talking for a little bit. We're going to see the deployment of a satellite, and we're going to see the rocket booster, the final stage. So that's the deployment, and there's, I'm presuming a back off. So now I'm kind of saying why, maybe. And then they're eliminating the fuel to passivate so it doesn't become a problem in the future. This is one of our famous videos where it says Kentucky. That literally was a telescope in a barn in Kentucky that we used early on in our company's history. It has been decommissioned. It wasn't actually, it required a person to go up in the hayloft and actually open the door. So not very good for a service. Next chart. So most of a satellite's life is very boring. 99% of the time, they're just following the natural forces. So they will maybe do station keeps. Those are interesting, but they're not interesting, but they happen. And if they're staying in their slot, that's kind of boring. This is a relatively young satellite that did not quite make it to the end of life. So anything that's this interesting are the things that we're trying to find. Next chart. This satellite made it to the end of its life, but it had a problem. Things started coming off of it, but the operator was able to remove it from geosynchronous orbit, and they were able to move it up to graveyard. So although it did have these problems, they were able to get it out of harm's way. So it's today over 300 kilometers above geo. Another example of something interesting that happens that we can see. Next chart. Okay, thanks to General Gutlein for preempting not only that we don't do why, we leave that to the professionals. We observe what happens. And so earlier this year, we observed through inference a satellite called SJ-21 grappling an old defunct satellite named Compass G2, and you just saw it grab it, this is a reconstruction, and bring it from what we'll call near geo to an orbit that had an apogee that was 3,000 kilometers above geo, and I think the perigee is around 300. So it is technically in the graveyard. They moved it quite a ways down the belt. So we wouldn't say why they did this. We would leave that to others. What I would note is that there are a lot of things that you have to do to figure out when something like this happens, because in this case, the way we knew they grappled it for sure, and we were convinced, we had two bits of evidence that confirmed it for us. One was Compass G2 disappeared. It's defunct. We have never seen it maneuver, and it was gone. Okay, so that was a good clue. And then over on the left-hand side of the video, we eventually saw it dropped off. And so a lot of what we learned was through inference, and a lot was through observations. But sometimes it's a tricky bit of investigating to figure out exactly what happened. Other things that were happening at the same time, I don't know necessarily the why, but in the bottom middle of the screen, there's a satellite named Luke Olymp that took that time to change from one slot to another, and it was sitting very near a satellite that was perhaps had a spot beam over the Ukraine, which we actually do know did. And that was right before the Ukraine war. At the time, we weren't sure that seemed important. Maybe in hindsight it does. On the top of the screen, there were a couple of satellites that were flying in formation, and right about the time when that capture happened, they went into rendezvous. And we were tracking them as two objects, and then we could only see one for a time. And then there was NOAA is a customer of ours, and there was a close approach with a piece of debris at that time, which was kind of near the Luke Olymp event there. And in the top right, there was a satellite that was having a close approach with a rocket body as it was drifting there. So those were the only interesting things happening. Everything else was just normal day in space. This particular animation, everything that is in the near geo region, those are states that were propagated from our orbits. Anything that is lower, and you see that fuzzy ball around the Earth, those are generated from the orbits from the 18th Space Defense Squadron. And I will give bonus points to anyone who can see the debris from the Russian ASAT test. It's been spinning around in front of you the entire time I've been talking. Still up in the air in January when we made this video. And that's it.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Doug. Next, Mick, introduce yourself very quickly, and can you talk a little bit, how can SSA help verify space norms of behavior?
Thanks, Victoria. So I'm Mick Gleason from the Aerospace Corporation's Center for Space Policy and Strategy. And thanks a lot for inviting me here today. I really appreciate it. I think you invited me here today because I wrote this paper, No Haven for Misbehaving. So please download it and make my life better if you did. So I appreciate that. So today we'll just be doing wave top, discussion a little bit about all the thinking that's in that paper. But if you really find something interesting that I say, please go look at the deeper thinking reflected in the paper. So how can SSA help verify space norms? I would like to change the question a little, if I may,
Please.
And say, how can SSA help a norm emerge, right? And so a few years ago, my colleagues and I, we said, okay, let's see if we can help it with this norms conversation. It's been going on for 10 or 12 years now. There's been a lot of talk and discussion on why we need norms. Once again, the who, what, why, where, how theme here today. So we decided that, a lot has already been said about why we need norms. We need it for space safety, space sustainability, stability of the space domain, and space security. Many of you here today are working in those areas with SSA. And so not much more needs to be said, in my opinion, or in that regard. So then we said, okay, what? So what should the norms be? And so there's a lot of discussion going on over the last several years on what those norms should be. Should it be about rendezvous and proximity operations, on-orbit space servicing, ASAT testing, and so forth. And so there's a lot of people also thinking about what those norms should be. And so we decided, well, let's start poking at how do you actually create norms? I mean, that's a pretty important question, right? You can't just say what we're going to do and why we're going to do. You actually have to have a process for how to create norms. So my colleague Robin Dickey, she produced the Building Normentum paper, maybe some of you have seen, which was our first production in this line of effort. And then last March, we released this paper, No Haven for Misbehaving, which we hope is helping to inform the thinking on how to get to norms of responsible behavior for outer space. So that's kind of how we got here. What I wrote about was that you have to, it turns out that verification is a key to creating a norm. And so SSA, for what's going on in space, is key. So we have sustainability, safety, security, stability, and I would like to add norms. You have to have SSA and data sharing in order to help create those actual norms that we're all working so hard to create. There's a long chain of reasoning, multi-step chain of reasoning behind some of this. So just to touch, once again, wave top level on some of the chain of reasoning. So first of all, complying with a norm, just like an arms control treaty, complying with a norm of responsible behavior implies giving up some freedom of action, right? And maybe some costs, maybe some material costs if you can't do something that you used to do, like it was easier, less expensive when debris wasn't such a problem. And so now it costs more to prevent debris. And so there's freedom of action costs and material costs that come with complying with a norm of behavior. But why would a country abide by a norm of behavior if that constrains your freedom of action if you can't verify that other actors are also complying with that norm of behavior. You know, you'd be tying your own hands and not knowing if anybody else is tying their own hands. So therefore, the verification becomes very crucial. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more tricky, is I think that the United States and allies and like-minded nations do a lot of SSA sharing agreements that have been mentioned already today. I think we have 30 plus SSA data sharing agreements with other governments, 120 with commercial companies, 3 with academia. And so the US and like-minded nations are trusting some of the SSA data being shared between each other. And that's crucial for if they're going to trust that they can comply with a norm of behavior, and it won't hurt them. But the flip side is other countries also must have the confidence to condemn bad behavior. If you want, like, how to create a norm, you can't just say, here's a norm. If people deviate from the norm or misbehave or practice irresponsible behavior, other countries have to condemn it. And so they have to have a trusted source of information. Maybe they're not, maybe they're outside of the US circle of the US allies and like-minded nations. And so if we want to get more countries to condemn irresponsible behavior in space, you need to do that to create a norm. And so the paper concludes, I'll stop here, with the need for some type of international framework for SSA data sharing that all countries in the world could partake in. Real quickly, I think 12 countries condemned the Russian ASAT test last November, 12 out of 193 countries in the world. And then about 15 commercial companies, so it's very good that commercial companies also raised their hand and condemned Russia's ASAT test. But what about the other 175 countries in the world who didn't say anything? So the US is trying to lead the way with allies and like-minded nations, but we got a long way to go to create a norm where the majority of countries in the world will stand up and say that's bad behavior. And I think SSA verification is key to that. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mick. And last, Dan, can you introduce yourself, and then talking a little bit about your experience with Leo Labs. What is currently technically possible for current SSA capabilities?
Thank you, Victoria.
Should be on.
Thank you, Victoria.
Should be on. I think it turns on.
Thank you. Trying a different microphone. All right. Any luck?
Hold up. Tech support is on its way.
All right. Is this, oh,
There
perfect.
we go.
Well, good morning. My name's Dan Sepperly. I'm the CEO and a member of the founding team of Leo Labs. And at Leo Labs, we're the commercial mapping platform for low Earth orbit. We build and operate a worldwide network of radars located on the ground, and we do a software system in the cloud that turns that information into actionable alerts that customers use to protect their spacecraft and detect threatening or abnormal behaviors in orbit. We focus in particular on low Earth orbit because it's quite busy. There's a lot of new satellites, especially a lot of new commercial satellites up there. And a big part of our business is safety of flight. And we're actually producing 500 million conjunction data messages every single month in support of those safety operations. And we also operate tools that enable our customers to zero in on precisely the alert, the piece of information that they need to be able to act in a very timely manner. So commercial, we've seen in low Earth orbit this kind of commercial revolution, all sorts of new satellites going into orbit, new rockets, and the like. And certainly, commercial industry is revolutionizing the way space domain awareness is done. And I'm quite happy to say that over 60% of all the operational satellites in LEO are using our commercial collision avoidance service today. So I want to spend just a real brief moment showing you a little bit about what we do and some interesting activities in space. So if we go to the next slide. This is actually a picture of the latest radar in our network. This is the Azores space radar off the coast of Portugal. We build ground-based phased array radars because radar enables us to track around the clock. That's absolutely essential in LEO during daytime, also during night when satellites in LEO are in the shadow of the Earth, through all weather conditions and the like. And we use phased arrays because there are many, many satellites flying overhead every hour, and we need to keep up with them. The real special sauce behind these radars is we're able to build them quickly. So we can go from breaking ground to delivering data in less than a year, and we've done that at many sites around the world. This is the 5th radar site in our network. We've got another one under construction in Australia that will be completed in a few months, and then 3 more in process after that. Now, these seem to be going very quickly, but actually this radar technology is many years in the making. Members of our founding team spent 30 years working with the National Science Foundation to perfect the radar technology to make it so that it could be remotely operated, operate in very harsh environments, and survive for years. And then myself and a few others spent 8 years with the US Air Force and DARPA working on new tracking technologies to get ahead of the CubeSat and mega constellation waves. So each radar appears to be an overnight success, but was actually 30 to 40 years in the making. Next slide. And just to show, Doug had some great examples of exciting and interesting events in GEO. In LEO, as everyone's heard, it's becoming quite congested and quite contested. This particular screenshot shows an ongoing proximity operation that we're monitoring right now. This data was from about 4 days ago, but it's 2 satellites operated by China that have been practicing proximity operations relative to one another for a while now, staying about a 1/4 kilometer to a 1/2 kilometer apart in range and also cross-track. This is certainly not an isolated event. We've seen proximity operations conducted by Russia. We've certainly saw the Cosmos 1408 anti-satellite weapons test back in November. On a more positive note, there's also commercial proximity operations, and we've seen Astroscale, for example, demonstrate an active debris removal technology mission. And just in LEO in general, we're seeing the population of satellites going up quite dramatically. 4 years ago, there were about 800 active satellites in LEO. Now there's about 4,000. Pretty soon, there should be tens of thousands of satellites. So LEO's getting quite exciting and quite important, and it's essential that we protect it so that we can keep the space industry growing. So thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Great, thank you, Dan. I'd like to remind everyone we're taking questions, so feel free to submit them through the app. With that, I'd like to start with the first question. It's probably more for the SSA operators, if anyone wants to chime in. I'd like to know what percentage of observed space objects turn out to be uncorrelated targets, which could generate further follow-up observations of interest. You guys want?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
What percentage? Well, so interesting. We do track everything that's up there. And the way that we identify objects is we first track everything as if it is an uncorrelated object that is not known. And then we use the public catalog from spacetrack.org to identify what each object is. And there are some that are left over. It used to be a higher fraction back, and I think it was, gosh, it's been 2 or 3 years now, so I don't remember the exact time, but there was a point at which the US government declassified a whole slew of what we were tracking as uncorrelated objects, and you'll see them as some of the satellites with names like AEHF and WGS and things like that. So when there were a lot of those were the objects, and they are no longer uncorrelated. What we see now is a very small number of them, and they are mostly debris, mostly the small debris that is either too small to track or where it's difficult to get a sense for what is the actual solar radiation pressure force that is on the object. So we do see a lot of those every night, and those are the majority of them. There are some that we can tell are something different, and we don't know what they are. So I'll just leave it at that. The fraction is actually very small now, but what it mostly is a lot of debris.
Try this microphone. Perfect. So in low Earth orbit, the situation a little bit different. One of the big reasons we founded the company was to start tracking small objects. So right now there are about 20,000 objects tracked in low Earth orbit, 10 centimeters and larger. 4,000 are functional satellites, about 16,000 are debris objects, dead satellites, dead rocket bodies, fragments. But there are hundreds of thousands of objects down to 2 centimeters in size, and we're pushing into tracking those. And so just from sheer numbers, the majority of the collision risk actually comes from those small objects. And objects even down to that 2 centimeters in size are moving fast enough to shatter a satellite and create more debris. So it's essential we avoid those. Also in low Earth orbit, maybe in the category of uncatalogued objects, we see more and more launches rapidly tracking those new payloads, getting counts, helping the satellites move into operations is critical. And of course, when there's a breakup or weapons test, rapidly cataloging all those objects is essential too. And actually the Cosmos 1408 test provided a very interesting use case there. Cosmos 1408 was a Russian satellite, dead satellite that we'd seen for years. Big piece of debris reliably passed over our radars multiple times a day. And then that morning, it went missing at one of the radar passes, which is not a normal occurrence. And so, 30 minutes later, about an hour later, it was due to pass over another radar. So we scheduled a follow-up, a kind of search window, and found actually 6 objects near where that satellite had originally been. A very good indication that something had happened. Follow-on radar passes, hour later, 2 hours later, we found 88 objects, then about 280 objects, and we were able to provide that sort of data out into the public sphere to show that actually this new debris had been created and was threatening commercial satellites and space stations and the like.
Thank you. So looking at, if we have the SSA available for verifying future space agreements, space security agreements, how good does that need to be? Like, what do we really need to be confident? Maybe as more political scientists could talk about when we're discussing this at the international level. What sort of, how comfortable we need to be in the SSA capabilities to understand that this behavior is either being followed or not being followed?
Was that to me?
Anyone?
So I'll just take a shot at it.
Sure.
So how good of the quality of the information,
Yeah.
how dependent is that? Well, I think it has to be pretty good. I'm not a technical person or an engineer, and there's a lot of people in this room who are. And so I would just say also equally important is how trusted the data is, the source of the data, is it called the provenance of the data, and so on and so forth. It has to be trusted, once again, for if you want to create a norm, which is a collective expectation of proper behavior, then the actors out there who you want to observe and believe that there's something bad going on, they need to trust the data. Or if there's something good going on, they need to be able to trust the data. So that's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Anyone else? Ben?
I think for this, it goes back to the treaty language in negotiating. It depends on whether that agreement is multilateral or bilateral. There's a big difference between how 2 actors, and building off what you just said, how 2 actors trust each other or don't trust each other, and what the deficit of trust necessarily increases the amount of verification and trust in that verification process that you have to have. If you have 2 actors that trust each other, you might be more accepting of lower confidence estimates or more uncertainty. If you trust your adversary less, then you need better verification. But it goes back to if you have 2 players in the game, or if you have 25, or if you have 150, the actors that can't, or the actors that have less experience in determining what is good data, can we collect our own data and verify internally, can we trust what other actors are telling us, that makes a huge difference in what the base level needs to be. Whether it can be sourced internationally, whether it can be sourced from a handful of nations, from one nation, in terms of getting to a point where everybody is comfortable.
I guess building onto that, so how do you get that trust? How do you get the confidence up?
That is a really good question.
Can you solve this for us, please?
So that there's a lot of experience in the nuclear arms control field of building expertise and building capacity in nations that don't have reason to have a lot of experience in nuclear issues, writ large, whether that's energy or weapons or what have you. There is a little bit of a reticence traditionally to building capacity for building capacity's sake. There has to be a purpose to it, and that's probably a good thing. I think in space that is readily obvious that everybody has that incentive. So how you do it is a really good question that I think that there are a lot of commercial options that with better accessibility, there's more ways and avenues for states to develop that expertise. But really it comes down to, do states and do parties to arms control agreements that must be verified, do they have the foundational organizational structure to absorb that? So it really starts from there. Like if a state doesn't really have a group of 5 people sitting in an office who can figure out how to do these pieces of math, then it's not going to work.
Yeah, there's a few other ingredients that I think will help build trust in the data that's being sent out there. First of all, transparency. The more transparent the operations are, the more transparent the algorithms are, the more transparent the provenance of the information, and so on and so forth, is going to build trust. I think the general said, free the data, right? And so that's important to build that trust so that other countries will believe the SSA data, or when we're saying another actor is acting irresponsibly. But then there's other things, like if there's some organization that's releasing the data, let's say CSPOC or the US, it helps if countries who you want to believe the information, if they have a say from the beginning in how the organization is structured. Now that's not going to happen right now for our SDA enterprise in Department of Defense, but if there's some future international sharing framework, you'd want to get as many international actors involved as early as possible in help setting up that system so they have a say in how it was founded, have regular meetings to have an input into how it's going. They can work on problems together. So how you set up an organization to share data also matters.
Alma?
If I may as well. Oh, does it work? Yes. I absolutely agree with what has been said so far. Building off on the transparency issue that you just mentioned, I'd like to underscore again that SSA is great, but it sometimes, especially when you have actors where there is not a lot of trust between them, it might be beneficial to complement SSA data with other mechanisms such as transparency and confidence building measures, and also with compliance with existing treaties or mechanisms like the Registration Convention, for example. If space objects are registered both domestically and internationally, that makes SSA data collection probably a lot easier. I would defer to that, on that to the experts, but I would imagine that would be the case. Also, building of what Ben said on the inspirations, let's say, that we can take from other domains, such as the nuclear domain, I would like to highlight that sometimes space security is seen as a sort of isolated domain, but it's not. When we talk about disarmament and arms control, everything is interrelated, right? So if the geopolitical climate is more cooperative in general on Earth, that would also have an impact on how geopolitics play out in space. So that's also something to consider.
Great, thank you. So another question for the panel. So we have SSA, we have arms, space security agreements, and let's say the SSA determines someone is not following best practices or someone's being irresponsible. Then what? What do we do?
That's a political choice. Again,
All right, what are some things that might be done? Like how might the international community approach it? How might the U.S. approach it? That sort of thing.
So the compensatory action issue it looms large over the process. You can get a great agreement, you can get a great verification process, and at the end of the day, if you don't have a way to enforce it, then all of your verification practices are really for naught. So verification at its core, it allows or enables enforcement. But that's, again, a political choice. We've seen in the past there are clear instances of treaty violations that go unpunished because the political strategy sees the options laid out of enforced by retaliation, enforced by rearming, enforced by other compensatory action, enforced by booting the non-compliant state out of the agreement and limiting their access to the rest of the global market or global engagement on topic X. That's not always a politically viable option for certain strategies. That's not to pass judgment on those political strategies, that's just the way that entities see it. There are great cases with presidential administrations opting not to enforce treaties because it would isolate countries that were seen as violators or non-compliant, and then essentially putting a nail, if not the final nail, in a policy of engagement and bringing those non-compliant countries back into the international fold so that they are bound by norms of behavior that we would really like to, that we, the United States, at the time really preferred those countries to adopt and practice.
Other thoughts?
So, oh, can I go for it? Okay, thank you, sorry. So I like to take it from a slightly different direction. Ben used the word enforcement several times, and in my personal opinion, that word carries a lot of baggage, right? Because like domestic law is enforceable because we have police and jails and courts and so forth. When we're talking about international voluntary norms, like enforcement just doesn't seem like the right word to me. However, I think there can be consequences for people not complying or actors not complying with irresponsible behavior. And so I prefer the word consequences rather than enforcement. And I think that would help move the discussion along sometimes when we get stuck in the rabbit hole talking about, but it's unenforceable, right? So yeah, but that doesn't mean there's no consequences. So the first level of consequence can be calling out the bad behavior, right? This is where my paper says, the more countries that do that, the more likely we are to actually create a norm. So you can rebuke the bad behavior, condemn the bad behavior, ridicule the bad behavior, and that just, is humiliating to, hopefully, to the bad actor, so that in the future they will comply with the norm because they want to avoid that kind of international ridicule. And so I'll stop there.
Okay, I'll move.
Yes, I think this is definitely an issue, not just when it comes to norms, but when it comes to international law. This is like the biggest criticism of international law. And I think when we were in law school, something that my international law teacher told us was that almost all actors comply with almost all of international law almost all of the time.
AMOS is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
Right. It's true that, that on occasion there can be some actors that do not comply with international law, but that doesn't mean that international law in itself is useless. We were with the Emergent program earlier this week, we were discussing how even with domestic laws, just because, we have a law against murder, for example, does that mean that nobody's going to commit murder at some point? Sorry to get so dark, but if you have a norm or if you have a law discouraging certain behaviors or encouraging certain behaviors, it creates a sort of widespread conduct, so to say. So when somebody deviates from that type of conduct, it's easier to do what you just referred to, that finger pointing, that calling out of those bad actors. And I think people in the international community do care about their reputation of being seen as a good actor because it encourages or it facilitates them being able to engage with other stakeholders, with other states. So that's important. And also, I would add, when you call out that behavior, do so by relying on existing mechanisms. So, for example, when it comes to outer space, we have the Outer Space Treaty. It might have its flaws, but it's been really successful in setting out the principles for space operations. And it's funny because it's not that often referred to. For example, we have Article 9, which talks about the due regard principle. When you see actors behaving in certain ways, some others might condemn, oh, that is a really bad action. You should not do, for example, kinetic ASAT testing, which has been in the news quite a lot recently. somebody could argue, oh, is that somehow related to the Outer Space Treaty? Is there a principle from the Outer Space Treaty that we could use to call out that bad behavior? So that is also something to keep in mind.
Doug?
And I don't want to contradict what you just said, because I don't know treaties, and so I'm a layperson when it comes to these things. But I did pull up the Outer Space Treaty on my phone, and it very specifically says that states shall avoid harmful contamination of space. And then I asked myself, well, is an anti-satellite test harmful contamination of space? And I thought, well, and then who signed it? And then I can scroll and find out that definitely India, Russia, China have all signed it. And then I asked myself as a technical type person, what is the point of the treaty? And I'm almost asking a question of the other three panelists. I don't understand how the whole process works, but the naming and shaming isn't working.
Does our international lawyer want to quickly respond to questions about Article 9?
I'll give it a shot. So we have a lot of domestic laws. We have speed limits. Has anybody here ever gone over the speed limit? Does that mean you believe we shouldn't have speed limits? So I think there are some speed limits provided by treaties and international law that help, put guardrails around behavior. And of course, people are going to violate those. And then, as Ben said, it's a political question on if you want to impose some kind of consequence for that. Like, do you get a ticket for speeding, or do the police give you a warning, or do they just let you go by because it's rush hour and they don't want to slow down traffic?
Ben?
So, to build on it and respond with an analogous case, the Chemical Weapons Convention provides states the option to use challenge inspections to go into another country or through through steps to investigate potential chemical weapons production facilities or facilities that produce chemicals that could be weaponized. No one has ever used a challenge inspection, and that is a problem because the Chemical Weapons Convention specifically outlines that is a mode of recourse. And since no one has ever used it, in the amount of time that the CWC has been around, that clause has really lost political acceptance in that states are reluctant to use that because no one wants to be the first one to really enforce it. So in the case of the Outer Space Treaty, where there are significantly less stringent enforcement mechanisms, if that's even really the less stringent is probably a generous phrase, it becomes even more difficult to enforce something when there's no true strong mechanisms for enforcement and nobody wants to be that first person to break the ice. So it really comes down to, if you are going to have an enforceable treaty, you have to start strong. And that's something with the extended history of the Outer Space Treaty that's been very difficult to do. So whether or not that reticence to enforce has been a self-fulfilling prophecy is frankly pretty important for that treaty, at least in my opinion, as we've seen with the CWC as an example case.
Right, and I'm going to jump in as the power of the chair to point out that these agreements are only as good as they're carried out and implemented. And I will point out that no country has ever said anti-satellite tests violate the Outer Space Treaty, and that's including the United States. Now, you could argue, as Ben said, why do they do that? Is it because they're trying to leave an option open for themselves, or they don't want to be opening themselves up to criticism? But it is a key point, and I think that we need to make sure these clauses are enforced. Is there any other comment? I have one more question for the panel, unless there's other thoughts. No. Okay. This is for the satellite SSA operators. When we're talking about identifying atypical behavior, how does that work? Do you guys have like an alarm that goes off when someone does something weird? Is it that your people are looking at it and you do it? Is this a thing machine learning identifies this? How does this happen? Do you want?
Yes, certainly. So a big part of what we do is trying to keep an eye on the entire catalog of objects that are up there. For us, it's a combination of automated alerts. So new debris is spotted, or maneuvers didn't happen or happened that were unexpected, or frankly, even a satellite goes missing and needs to be hunted down. The other aspect of it, though, is still the people. And so, for example, at Leo Labs, we have a team of about 130 people. And in fact, about half of them are data science and software engineering and operations. And we've got teams in the US and Australia and Japan, and they're able to also keep a close eye on events or such as launches that might be of high interest or respond really rapidly if something's flagged. There's a lot of talk about kind of AI and fixing things with a sprinkling of AI here and there, but you know, there's a lot of companies that do artificial intelligence for space. You know, Leo Labs is one of them. There's probably 20. But what we found is if AI alone was going to solve the problem, it probably already would have done that. So having the combination of big sensor networks and teams that are equipped to work with those systems are quite important.
Doug, anything to add?
Yeah. Number one, I would invite everyone to attend my talk later today. It'll be in the last session. I think Dr. Moribajah is the session chair. I will be talking about that in a bit of detail, whatever I can slam into your brains in 12 minutes. But what we do is we gather, I think it's about 15,000 observations every 15 minutes. And we take all those, we correlate them to our catalog, update orbits, and look for the following interesting behaviors. Most of the geosynchronous satellites are going to maintain a slot. And there are a lot of maneuvers that happen just in slot maintenance. And so actually we detect those and we filter them out. We don't alert on anything like that. What we do focus on is any maneuver anyone does that would cause them to exit their slot. And so we just look for that all the time. You're going to see some examples of an algorithm that we wrote back when AMC9 started shedding pieces. We thought it would be really good to have an algorithm that would detect the next time that happens, because the only reason we saw that was because they had asked us to find the satellite. They had lost it. And so we tracked it for them for 2 weeks, and at the end of 2 weeks they said, hey, great job, thank you, we no longer need your services. And then the next day it went into a tumble and started spitting out pieces. I can't confirm or deny that they came off of the spacecraft, I have to say that. And so we said, hey, we really need to write an algorithm and an automated system that is going to find the next time this happens in the future. And so we have algorithms that do that. If a satellite goes into a tumble, we will find one. And I'll tell you, recently we had a satellite that did just that, maybe a week or two ago. And they were not a customer, but we saw it, and we reached out to one of our employees that we thought might have known the operator, and they were very happy for that information. They were having some trouble with the spacecraft, but having that added bit of information from the ground saying that we see you tumbling helped them understand the problem better, and they recovered the spacecraft, and no one knew there was any problem, and you'll never see their name in space news, I guarantee it. All is good. And that's the way we want it, because we don't want to be the paparazzi of space. We would like to be helping the operators operate in a more safe manner. Those are the kind of things we look for. It runs 24/7. Last thing I'll say is we put an analyst on the loop for everything that the system spits out. We have an analyst there examining, is this real or not? And a lot of our emphasis the last few years has been building the tools to allow the analyst to sit on top of the loop and rapidly look at what the little bit of machine learning, mostly physics, is spitting out about what it thinks about the spacecraft.
Great, thank you. Well, I know we've eaten into the coffee break a little bit. I appreciate your audience's patience, but please join me in thanking the panel for an excellent discussion today. With that, I think we're on break. Thank you guys very much.